For the sake of clarity, Komorebi is a visual novel and by its very nature is story dependent. This video is going to go deep into spoilers, so I'll just say, read it. My too long didn't watch take for those who have yet to do so, it's a 10 out of 10 experience. Emotionally profound masterpiece, or whatever. Click off the video and spend $20 to have an existential crisis like I did, go put yourself through the emotional ringer like the rest of us, then come back. Now that the uninitiated are hopefully on their own journey, the rest of us can sit down and digest. I feel as though I'm making this video as a means to discuss this visual novel since it has yet to leave my thoughts. Although for the sake of brevity, I'll be using terms like game and play, since that just rolls off the tongue better and I would rather not have the "are visual novels video games" discussion, since there's not enough ibuprofen on the planet for me to argue semantics right now. Now on to the discussion proper, and there's no better place to start than the glaring anthropomorphic elephant in the room, and that is, this game is a gay furry visual novel. That is like 3 layers of natural homegrown gatekeeping, making the appeal remarkably niche and specific. For most people, it is a Herculean feat to overcome this hurdle. And you know what? I really like that. Broad appeal for the sake of financial gain has always been an Achilles heel for art, and most artists tend to perform a balancing act in hope of eating dinner that night, so I respect someone who goes well out of their way to make media with niche appeal. What isn't a barrier to me is to others for reasons I lack the time or, like previously stated, the ibuprofen to deal with such a discourse. Honestly though, it does make the story feel a little more special. I didn't get filtered by the art, and instead was drawn in by it for, admittedly, remarkably shallow reasons. I had no expectations going in besides to romance hot anthros, and instead got yanked into a grounded, dystopian world on the cusp of major societal changes with compelling, tragic characters on their own personal journeys that interweave into a multi-layered metaplot. I am a general outsider to the furry community, never have been it enough to call myself one, but on the flip side, I have a moth persona. Call me furry adjacent, but because of that I have no actual grounding in the media trends of the community whatsoever. Going into the whole stigma aspect though, why was I not expecting a good story? Has my mid to late 2000s internet use poisoned my expectations? This is an internal debate that's been permeating my thoughts as of late. I obviously don't harbor hate or disdain for furries, I even dated one for 4 years, but regardless, my expectations were lowered because of my preconceived prejudice. Arguably though, this enhanced my experience, since these lowered expectations were blown away in every conceivable manner. This may seem tangential, but the fact that this game uses anthros is a bigger player in its story than one would initially imagine. Now hopefully my meandering just hasn't completely turned you off and we can move on to elements of the actual game. With external context out of the way, let's move on to internal context. No better place to start than with the actual namesake of the game, Komorebi itself. From what I can gather, the world is similar to ours up until a major turning point that happened about 100 years before the start of the actual plot. Basically, the vast majority of people were suddenly afflicted with an intrusive vision of their future. There seems to be no rhyme or reason as to the type of vision, other than it's there and it invades the day-to-day life of everyone who experiences it. In the wake of this new phenomenon, a giant company named Argus takes the reins of things and somehow gets the go-ahead to implement a global social credit system to keep people in line. Interestingly enough though, since the story is multiple generations away from the genesis of these foundational historical events, the people in the world take these functions rather casually. To us, an outsider, this world seems rather dystopian and miserable, but to the inhabitants of the world, this is their status quo. So much so that we get very little explanation, since the system is so culturally ingrained and normalized that nobody needs to go out of their way to explain it initially. From the moment the prologue begins, we are just thrust into the world through the lens of the protagonist named Delta. Delta himself being an interesting character because, unlike most other romance visual novel protagonists, Delta has a defined personality and backstory beyond ties to the potential romantic partners. There is this element of almost role-playing in a sense. Delta's most defining feature, though, is their lack of Komorebi, in that they are in a rather small minority of people who just lack a vision of the future, a really smart decision overall from a character writing perspective. Komorebi is such an abstract concept that I struggle to emotionally wrap my head around it. It leads me to ask, how would I react to an obsessive vision of my future? Would that be a bane or boon to my overall well-being? This ultimately serves as a way to ground ourselves into the role of Delta, since us, the player, are essentially in the same boat. Doubly so since I found myself struggling to properly empathize with the other main characters because they are all afflicted with Komorebi. This emotional disconnect creates a strong barrier between us and the world, just like it's a natural emotional barrier between Delta and the rest of the cast. Basically though, Delta need a change of scenery in life, so they decide to move to, let me check my notes here really quickly, Toronto, from, I'm not really sure where. As a side note about this, these characters are Canadian, but in this globalized dystopian future, that's like if your local Apple store was a cyberpunk dystopia, are there any traditional national borders? It'll be important later, but my weird thought here is, are they even Canadian if the whole world's globalized? Anyway, Delta moves in with an online friend of theirs named Isaac, who, out of all the characters, is probably the one my opinion on has changed the most. We are introduced to him as a kind and caring person, willing to open up his home to a friend, yet he has a mischievous streak where he bends and even breaks a few rules here and there. Mix that in with his need for surprises and poor communication gave me really mixed vibes from the start. Like, he has good intentions with all of his actions, that's obvious, but he simultaneously frustrated me because, as you'll see, he has a habit of getting others wrapped up into any and all of his shenanigans against their will. He has a good heart though, so I can't hate him beyond his fur pattern, which rubs me the wrong way for reasons I struggle to articulate. He brings Delta home and introduces them to his roommate and best friend, Dante. Dante is a more introverted person who is a novelist by trade. Immediately we get to see conflict between the both of them, bickering over Isaac being Isaac and tampering with the compulsory Argus technology within their abode. It shows how comfortable they are with each other though. A classic media trope of, the ones who are closest bicker like a married couple is in full swing here. For Dante, this enlightens us to his initially more abrasive nature, but, like Isaac, his intentions are also good. Isaac may be employed by Argus, but Dante does not want him, or others, to be labeled as accomplices to illegal activity. Because yup, technically, Delta's landlord works for the spooky, all-seeing Conglomocorp that runs the world. But this leads to a really interesting dichotomy between Isaac and Dante. The wage slave to the company being the rebel, while the artistic novelist wanting to maintain security regardless of how low he says his score actually is. During the week, they both deign it time to introduce Delta to their mutual friend Taylor. Taylor, or also known as Local Best Boy, is a seemingly very outgoing streamer who's overtly flirtatious, much to the dismay of everyone around him. Remarkably business-oriented too, as we see later. He doesn't skip on an opportunity to profit. A notable trait that's regularly brought up is his rather light disposition in regards to alcohol. A very cost-effective drinker if you get drunk easy, and mixed then with his amorous nature is just asking for potential chaos. He provides plenty of lighthearted moments for the crew regardless of what is going on in their lives both individually and collectively. We are later formally introduced to the other two main characters, the first of which being Clace, and wait a minute, I need to cross-reference some keywords here for a second. Yes, I see. Clace is also the name of the developer. I'm just gonna place a pin in that and move on for now. Clace is a famous pop idol who's taking a break from the hustle and bustle of stardom to rest and just live his life. His introduction notably stuck out to me, having a casual, normal conversation with Delta while simultaneously putting on airs for those around him who recognize his fame. It is rather tragic, gives off the vibe that he struggles to be genuine and needs to put on a persona to maintain his image. For being a superstar, he is rather quiet and reserved. His face is nearly constantly buried in his diary. Also, like, pink is my favorite color, so I can't really hate him. And then there's Chiron, the resident outsider of the group. He's stuck in a rather interesting circumstance within the plot. He is what is called a zero. Someone who lives outside the system. People who forego the strict order of society are essentially exiled outside the cities and live on colonies. To be exiled is essentially to curse your entire bloodline, since Argus doesn't allow any zeros to enter the system, meaning that there are some multiple generations removed from the decision of their ancestors. This is the central conflict of the whole narrative, since some zeros were able to enter Toronto to protest. Chiron, though, says he's there to see the city and serves as a vehicle for us to learn more about the world. What is interesting is that clearly the world depicted in Komorebi is dystopian in nature, but to plenty of the Zeros, the city is something they long for, and Chiron's no exception. It's all a matter of perspective, since you could argue the colonies are more free, but it is clear early on that living on them is a struggle, only compounded by Argus slowly expanding cities outward, eating away at what land the Zeros have. On a side note about this central conflict, I really do need to commend Clace on how it was all handled, and ideally should serve as a prime example on how to write a socio-political conflict in fiction. A big gripe I have with many stories is that they create a different or fantastical world that has the same issues as our own, and those stories become just a means for the writer to pontificate whatever belief they hold. With Komorebi, the plight of the Zeros can match many different issues and allows us, the player, to imprint our own beliefs onto it. It could be a race issue, or even one about borders. For me, I like to view it as a disconnect between those who live in urban and rural environments because that issue is relevant to me and where I live. Regardless of how you perceive the issue, it is still unique to its world and isn't bound by our current one. But now back to Chiron himself. In his own words, he is there to see the city, a dream of his ever since he was a small child. Like the rest of the Zeros though, he can't really buy anything, so when he crosses paths with the other protagonists, Delta gives him an apple. One could point this out as the inciting incident, at least for Delta, a small, selfless action to change the course of their life. I could speculate it being an apple could be a callback to the Apple of Knowledge, bringing enlightenment to the concept of good and evil, but that could just be me extrapolating. Those 6 make up the entirety of what I would call the main cast of characters. There are 2 side characters, one of which becomes relevant at the end of the plot, but the other has more staying power, and that's Delta's therapist. Historically, people who don't experience Komorebi usually end up being more emotionally unstable, so they get assigned a therapist. The dynamic between Delta and their therapist is also rather interesting to watch happen, as when more of the plot unfolds, the less Delta is able to disclose. Kind of an inversion of a therapist-patient arc you would usually see in fiction. Delta becoming more closed off because of the fear of consequences for things well beyond their control. But enough about the side characters, and now back to the main cast, and to discuss the aspect that drew me into this particular adventure initially: the romance. Because of how segmented this game is, the bulk of these romantic ventures is segregated into individual, heart-to-heart fragments. Each character gets a total of 5 sprinkled throughout the story, and each one opens up to Delta at their own pace. Some, like Isaac, are down to date immediately, while others take more time to open up. Also, they are so willing to be involved in a poly situation type deal, because of course they are! About this from a gameplay perspective, there are achievements associated with plenty of things in the game, and one of which is dating all of them at once, along with ones for them individually as well. Ultimately, the correct option the game is pushing you towards is going all in, and I personally would recommend doing so as well since you'll get most of the experience. Trust me, it really isn't worth self-inserting and being monogamous with Taylor like I did, because of course I did! Just take this advice now and just go all out with the whole crew, but if you don't, you aren't going to miss important character moments either, unless you purposely skip the heart-to-hearts, but why would you want less content? And before you ask, yes, you can friendzone everybody, and you'll still get the tragic anime backstories as well. I think it'll be fun to dive into discussing each character by how much they escalate things, so that means starting with our novelist Dante. He reveals very early on he essentially lived in a library and read a ton of books growing up because of this. Apparently he spent more time at the library than at home though, since the situation back there seems to have been not so great. He is a runaway who sought shelter in fiction and in turn decided to write his own. His vision of the future shows him having a constructive and positive relationship with his parents and his younger brother he has yet to meet. Torn between the mistreatment and chaos of the past with the allure of stability and hope of the future, until tragically he reveals in the end that when looking into his family records, they all passed away from a gas leak. As horrible as this revelation is, Dante takes it pretty well after the initial shock passes. The ending of his character arc embodies the idea of closure, the idea that even if the news is bad, it is better than being left guessing. That and he can always visit his family in his vision, spinning Komorebi more positively for him unlike everyone else. Next up is Taylor, the flirtatious showman, little orphan Taylor who was in foster care for his entire childhood. You know the fat kid in movies who bullies everyone else? That was him. He would cause trouble and get transferred somewhere else, never establishing roots or long-term emotional connections. One day though, another kid has enough of his shit and takes advantage of Taylor's food allergy and has him hospitalized from a catastrophic reaction. He then loses a bunch of weight, turns 18, and gets booted out of the foster care system and is on his own. Luckily, the only part of him that stayed large was his personality, and he became a popular streamer rather quickly and was able to establish a foundation in Toronto. Then he met Isaac, and as they say, the rest is history. His vision of the future is rather fascinating in that it is complete darkness, leading him to fear dark isolation, hence why he seeks so many romantic and sexual partners. His experiences, both in the past and the potential future, warping his perspective on relationships in the present. My clearly non-professional take is that he desires stability so he doesn't have to be alone anymore. But speaking of romantic relationships, we have Chiron. Chiron, being born and raised on a colony, has very little understanding of the ways of them city folk. He was always an outsider, wanting in on whatever the city dwellers have. Colony life is full of toiling and hardship. They are very much the if you don't work, you don't eat kind of society. Everything gets rationed out based on their input. Well, sadly, while climbing a tall tree to get a view of the city, Chiron's former lover falls and gets horribly injured, thus leading him to starve. It seems no place in this world is perfect. Those in the colonies live free from Argus and the system, yet their way of life seems cruel and brutal. Makes sense why Chiron would want to at least see the city. We as people tend to suffer from a grass is greener effect in our own lives, and our media tends to reflect these thought patterns. I tend to see this line of thinking a lot in online discourse. This story subverted my expectations of the colonies primarily because I was expecting their way of life to be painted as the good way, being more in tune with nature and whatnot. Threw me for a loop for sure. Are you sad yet? To double up on said sadness, his vision shows him in the future, on the colony, living life like nothing had changed, feeling cursed to live the life that, at that point, took everything from him. The next character on the itinerary to talk about is Clace, and this is a rough one for me. Story time, actually! I ate some edible gummies before a reading session, and then I got to the part where Clace does the same. I guess that day me and him were on the same wavelength, but anyway, that turned out to be a double-edged sword since his whole storyline is the most emotionally turbulent, so there were many moments that hit me like a ton of bricks. The whole linchpin of this tumult of emotional gut punches was the moment of Delta's betrayal in the third fragment map. Clace was being mighty sus with his journal and phone calls, so Delta took it upon themselves to break into his journal and get answers, violating the trust Clace puts in them. The moment is only compounded by the uncomfortable, seemingly self-destructive imagery within the diary. It just feels incredibly gross overall. Thankfully, his vision has less to do with self-harm and way more to do with murder, because that's so much better. Clace's vision is of him being murdered in the future, which leaves a remarkably negative emotional toll on him. It's rather fascinating since his vision is reminiscent of post-traumatic stress disorder, but for an event that hasn't happened, it may never come to pass. Juxtaposing this vision with Dante's, which has a much more positive spin, shows the range of Komorebi as a condition, but only serves to make it more baffling in the end. The emotional barrier between Clace and Delta is the strongest, since he is so pained and it's just impossible for Delta, and subsequently the player, to comprehend, which is only compounded by the major moment of betrayal hanging above it all. Basically, the moral of all this is don't do drugs before reading something emotional, or you may get paralyzed for a second and want to reevaluate your existence. Or just not at all, and be sure to follow your local laws and regulations and other asterisks to remove any nebulous liability for myself and place it solely on you, dear viewer. I am sure you're keeping tabs on things and are aware that the final boy to discuss here is Isaac, the true main character of the entire plot, but to explain why, I need to lore dump for a second. I mentioned earlier that the Zeros are in the city protesting for the right to buy food, but how'd they get there? Well, there's a sort of rebellion group that snuck them in called Cypher, which is led by their nebulous leader Hermes. Isaac is Hermes and is the driving force behind every event in the plot, both good and bad. Apparently, his vision of the future was of the events of the game itself, but after everything was said and done, he is alone. Not only is our boy under immense pressure from changing the world, but is also trying to navigate everyday life. Bro legit tries to cultivate a romance while effectively being a terrorist. Anyway, his vision gives him a crippling fear of losing his friends. Why change the world if you lose what's most important to you? If you haven't figured it out yet, Isaac is the main character, and Delta is his love interest. Delta, and by proxy us the player, have no agency over the main plot. We are just carried along for the ride. Isaac, working well outside the boundaries of the law, gives a very valid explanation to his very secretive nature. Once everything fell into place, I learned to love him more. It also helps his traumatic backstory revolving around the murder of his father only makes him more endearing in the long run. Honestly, all the boys deserve a hug. But let's put the hugging to the side currently and go back a few sentences. The point about our lack of agency. Remember that pin I placed way back earlier? Time to unleash the main thesis of the video, which is my interpretation of the overall point of the story. There are many moments of the story where even more agency is taken away from us. Notably, reading Clace's journal. We can't really say no to the whole situation. After a while, it becomes clear we are not here to self-insert as Delta and make decisions for them, we are role-playing as Delta. The story hints early on, and flat out describes later, that Argus is developing technology to relive your memories or even live out the memories of others. Once you connect all these dots, you realize the mouse cursors of the Argus corporate logo and the memory fragment map itself is recontextualized as well. We are just flat out not Delta. We are watching the events unfold from their point of view. I guess this is the second layer of the story, where we, the player, are incorporated into the narrative. But there is another layer. Remember when I made the point that Clace is the persona of the developer? Beating the game reveals some of the other characters are personas for other people. This whole game is essentially a big meta role-playing session. For the uninitiated, a big part of fursuiting for many people is playing the role of their character, to the point many refuse to actually speak and instead go for a more esoteric means of communication, like squeakers. I do have circumstantial evidence to my point about the layered plot though, beyond speculation. In regular intervals throughout the game, our main cast end up playing was essentially Dungeons & Dragons, and their campaign apparently takes place in the world of the dev's previous visual novel, Winds of Change, which I haven't played. Anyway, these sessions both serve as foreshadowing and red herrings for the overarching plot itself, while also serving as a neat meta sublayer. We are in a world populated by people's personas, role-playing as a side character, who is role-playing as a side character. I know being meta isn't exactly a new concept for visual novels. It wasn't new when Doki Doki Dogshit did it, wasn't new when Zero Escape did it, and I doubt it was new when Muv-Luv Alternative did it. Anyway, what I'm saying is this isn't my first rodeo, and yet I'm still impressed, simply because Komorebi understands its market and caters the layers to the furry crowd's interests. Basically, the aesthetic serves a larger purpose beyond appealing to furries. Instead, the aesthetic is a key pillar to understanding a major angle of the plot that isn't explicitly told to the player. Ultimately, in the end, we are never really told our role within the story, beyond Delta and their notes making a point we don't seem malicious, but I don't think that's entirely pertinent. It is as relevant as you or I reading a history textbook, since yeah, this game is like getting a good glimpse into a major historical event from an alternate world. To say the plot escalates is kind of an understatement. In a matter of 15 hours, you go from the new kid in Toronto to being an accomplice and introducing the free market to the world's social credit system. Isaac's grand scheme is to allow competitors to rise up against Argus, which is rather interesting. You would think a story about toppling corrupt authority would end with the destruction of Argus, but no, not exactly. It makes sense overall, since Argus was the one to fill the void of chaos caused by Komorebi. Not only was the social credit system heavily ingrained into society and culture, but it was introduced as a way to mitigate the fallout. To topple the system would be to topple the entirety of society as a whole. This revelation is pretty poignant overall and raises many questions revolving around politics and economics that I'm not smart enough to even begin to provide answers to. On their way out of Argus HQ, Isaac has the foresight to copy sensitive data that Argus has, which leads to the emotional climax of the story. I imagine the climax of the story was the escape from Argus HQ itself. It had the intensity and drama. Even Isaac got shot! I guess you could call that the narrative climax, but I like to imagine the emotional climax is the come down afterward. With these world-changing, sensitive details in the hands of Isaac, he is left with the final decision. Does he reveal all the dark and dirty details to the world, or does he destroy his copy? If he were to enlighten us and the world about Argus's true nature, he would turn away his friends, who genuinely don't want targets on their backs. This finale is actually really incredible, because we can see the step-by-step actions it would take for Isaac's vision to come to reality. In the end, he did enough and chose his bonds over anything else, defying his vision and changing history. It is implied everyone defied their visions. I like to think everyone did and took destiny into their own hands. In the end, Komorebi is a tale about the beauty of life. It gives us the experience of walking a mile in someone else's shoes while subsequently seeing a group of friends learn to understand each other better. By the end of the story, their visions are irrelevant to their futures, giving the cast a taste of the lives of Delta and us, without pre-existing knowledge looming over us. A world where everyone is a little more equal, the zeros to the city dwellers and the ones with Komorebi and those without. Nobody can fully empathize with another person, but just a little goes a very long way, and I really enjoyed how much humanity I saw in these characters that were decidedly non-human. Basically, this game was one I'm not going to forget anytime soon. A story that is so niche, I struggled to find a way to talk about it, hence why this video exists in the first place. So if you made it this far, I really appreciate it, since you unknowingly became my outlet for just me talking about something I really enjoyed. Also, Clace, please don't murder me for potentially spoiling the plot for someone, so to mitigate this, if you watch this and decide to have things spoiled for you, joke's on you because I didn't spoil everything. There are many wonderful moments to enjoy, so go buy it to mitigate the negative karma I inflicted upon myself and give the pink furry creature your money. It's worth every penny. But the story does raise one question that I don't know how to feel about, probably the most incomprehensible emotion that I simply cannot empathize with. How does it feel to have your monopoly on the world's social credit system usurped by a gaggle of gay, polyamorous stoners? I'll never know. I must say, this is the first video for this channel, and if you watched all the way to the end, I appreciate it. This is like an unscripted little bit that I'm just going to do. That's kind of like a impromptu thing, so you can see how I sound without a script to follow, because I worry I sound robotic or not interesting, which I'm trying to get better just through skill, sheer force of will, or something of the matter, but whatever. It's kind of weird, because, like, I feel like parts of the script didn't even age well, because, like, just straight up, okay, I'm going to point this out really quickly. Let me go find it. Okay, so this, like, final bit of recording is, like, right after Labor Day, so I was going to make a point here. I found this article on CNN that happened right before. NYPD to deploy drones to monitor Labor Day weekend gatherings, raising civil liberty concerns. It's like, oh, joy. Me saying this isn't indicative of our reality is just getting closer every moment, even from before this video started production to after. Existential dread aside, I do want to make one point. Like, I obviously make, like, a few jokes, like the ironic totally not a furry guys thing. Before I recorded this, I was, like, looking into other YouTubers, see if they ever did videos on this game, and there was, like, this whole, not really YouTubers, but streamers and all this other thing, there's this whole layer of just, like, people, like, treating it 100% ironically. And it's just like, that sucks because this story is actually really cool. But so if I knew that ahead of time, I probably would have laid off on the, like, me being ironic, even though I myself am on, like, layer 666 of irony. But it's that whole thing. It's just a joke. I'm just chilling. You know, I'm not, like, super ironic, like, oh guys, I'm not that insecure. I'm insecure, but not that much, okay? That's the whole thing. Like, I think that was part of the joke, at least what was intended. I don't know, me explaining the jokes also shows the insecurity that I said I'm not that much, so whatever. You know, that just ends this whole end slate segment. Thanks for watching video. Whatever, have a good day.